Good afternoon, brethren. Great to be here with you today. Thank you for your prayers for Anna. You've probably heard that she had surgery on both of her legs in order to correct how they were growing. And so that was successful, but she's struggling to recover. And with both of the legs healing, it's hard to get around. And so we actually are going to have to probably get her a wheelchair in order to get her back to school, to go down all those long hallways at middle school. So she has quite a road to recovery in front of her, but so far so good. So I just got back from a guy's trip to Ireland. Traveled all the way to Dublin just to bring this message back to you today, because I have a message for you from Ireland. So this was a story that was from 1492. So at the same time that Columbus was sailing over to America for the first time, this drama was going on in Dublin. There were two powerful families of the city, and they were vying for control. The one family was the Fitzgeralds, and the other family was the Butlers. Now, the Fitzgeralds had the upper hand, and they were winning the battle. And so the Butler clan sought refuge in St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the largest cathedral in Ireland, was built way back in the 1200s. So they sought refuge in that cathedral, because apparently in Ireland, slaughtering people was okay as long as they're not in a church. So they went into the church and they were safe there. But they were holed up, and it was at a stalemate. And so Fitzgerald had the church surrounded, and he was calling on Butler to come out and said, we won't harm you, we'll give you peace if you come out. And Butler, he was pretty sly. He wasn't born yesterday, and he sensed a trap. And he said, there's no way that I'm going to come out because you're going to kill me. And so Fitzgerald did something very unusual, which is he went to the door of the church that separated the two camps, and he had a hole cut in the door, and he reached his arm through the door. And he said, okay, Butler, you can either cut off my arm or you can shake my hand in peace. And Butler thought, well, if he's going to sacrifice himself, put himself at risk so much, that he must be serious about peace. And sure enough, Butler shook his hand, and there was peace in the city at that time. That is the cathedral, St. Patrick's Cathedral. So that was already hundreds of years old when that drama took place, because it was built in the 1200s. So I took that picture, and one unusual thing about that, if you look at the sun, this was taken like at 1 p.m., like right after noon, and that's how high the sun is. So if you want a lot of sun, don't go to Ireland. Go to Florida, someplace like that. But it's a very old, beautiful church, and if you look in the north part of it, you're to see that door. And that was the original door that Fitzgerald sawed through and put his arm through. And that stands, and it's called the Door of Reconciliation. And it's there as a reminder for how those people in Dublin made peace. And so there are some aspects of reconciliation that we can talk about, some lessons from this. One main aspect of reconciliation for us as Christians is reconciliation with God, of course. So Fitzgerald, in that story, Fitzgerald was more powerful than Butler. His armies were winning. He could have gone in, he could have stormed through the door, broken it down, taken everybody prisoner, he could have slaughtered them. He had the upper hand, could have done what he wanted. And likewise, God is infinitely more powerful than we are. He could destroy us, he could force us into things, and yet he takes another approach because he wants a relationship with us. And a relationship is something that comes from both sides. It's a mutual thing. He wants us to reach and accept his offer of a relationship, of reconciliation. In fact, Christ says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. So we're reconciled to God through Jesus Christ, who is the door. God is reaching to us through the door for reconciliation. And as first fruits, this is our time to be reconciled with God. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 18, "Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ." So again, the reconciliation happens through Christ. But then the next phrase gives us a mandate. It says, he has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So ministry, that's like a job, a service, or a duty that we have to be reconciled, which is the other aspect of reconciliation with other people, with our fellow man, with our brothers. And when it comes to reconciliation with others, we need to risk something oftentimes. But if we risk something, we can potentially lose something. Fortunately, nowadays, we're not literally losing our arm, but we do have to reach out. We're risking rejection, we're risking losing face, and taking that risk that has a name, and it is being vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable when it comes to reconciling with somebody and rebuilding a relationship. Right? God, he sacrificed something for reconciliation, and likewise we sacrifice or risk something when we reconcile with somebody. With Fitzgerald, it was only after he chose to risk something important that his reconciliation attempt actually succeeded with Butler inside the church. And the parable of the talents, it's not about reconciliation, but it is about Christ giving his servants something and saying, go and take that risk. Right? When you take a risk, you may not succeed, but still it's worth it, because if you want to succeed at something, you have to take the risk. You have to start. You can't just bury the talent like the one person and avoid all risk, because you're never going to make it if you do that. We can't be fearful and take that approach. So grudges can stand in the way of that. And if we continue with the door analogy, if you think of a grudge as something so heavy that it takes both hands to hold, then you can't reach your hand through that door to offer reconciliation if you have both of your hands holding on to that grudge. Nor can you accept and shake the hand that's being offered to you if you're holding that grudge. And if we don't reach out, then we're going to be trapped. Right? The Butlers were safe where they were, but they were also trapped. Right? They didn't want to live their whole life inside that cathedral. That wasn't how they were meant to be. And so they took the risk, and peace came, and it was good then for everybody. So the Irish people, they know a lot about reconciliation because they've been through a lot. This is Ireland. Most of Ireland has been free from Britain. They've been independent for a little over 100 years. And Ireland is mostly Catholic, little Protestant, but mostly Catholic. And they got their independence. They fought a war. It was a tough war, but they're free. The thing is that Northern Ireland had more Protestants than the rest, and they liked being part of the UK. And so they opted to stay. So they're still part of the UK. In fact, when we drove from the south to the north, everything changed. It used to be that there were giant guard towers and checks looking for bombs and things like that, because there was a lot of battles still. Even in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they called that the Troubles, because Northern Ireland, the Protestant majority opted to stay. The Catholic minority, they felt shortchanged, and they still wanted to be free, they wanted to be away, and they felt like they weren't. And so there was a terrorist campaign to try to wear the British out and say, okay, we give up, you can be independent. And there used to be guard towers and all these checks because bombs were being smuggled in. Nowadays, you hardly even know that you're crossing over because you don't have to stop. It's just suddenly all the signs are in miles rather than in kilometers. That's how you know that you've switched from one country to the other. But that went on for a long time, that there were almost constant bombings and assassinations and drive-by shootings by the IRA, which is the Catholic side, and then they would go too far, and then the Protestants had their own paramilitary organization, and they would kill some people in revenge for the ones that the IRA killed, and it went on for 30 years. Everybody would say, you're crazy to go visit Belfast. And it finally ended when both sides agreed to put down their arms. It was in 1998, so not all that long ago when they did. And so they kind of reconciled, but you've heard the saying that peace is not just an absence of war. And what they have over there right now is an absence of war. But it's not quite like anybody would want it to be. So this is on the Catholic side of the city. The city is still partitioned, and people don't always cross from one side to the other. So this is the side to their fallen people who were killed by the British Army or the Protestant paramilitary organization. And if you look at what they say, this is dedicated to those who have resisted and still resist the occupation of our country by Britain. So they lay down their arms, but if they're not done, they still feel like an injustice is being perpetrated on them. So at the bottom, they say, and your reward will only be a united Ireland. So if they thought they could achieve that by picking the arms back up, they would, right? So this is a peace that is not really a stable peace. And likewise, the Protestant paramilitary organization, the Ulster Defense Force, they have their own monument, their memorial to their fallen soldiers, and they talk about the injustices that were done on them. And the city is still divided into two parts by this wall. And some would like to see the wall go down, but people are still on edge that they think this could restart at any time, and then we'll be without a wall, and people will easily be able to do a bombing on one side and easily escape to the other side. So it stays up. In fact, you can write on the wall, they call it a peace wall now. You can write a message of peace for Ireland or for other parts of the world that are having wars right now. But during this, both sides had to give something, and even though it wasn't a perfect reconciliation, it's so much better than what they had. They had to be a little bit vulnerable and trust that if they lay their arms down, the other side wouldn't take advantage of that. And so far, that peace has held for the most part. Still, though, this is a gate, and every night the gate gets closed, so you can't cross from the Protestant side to the Catholic side because they're still worried that something could come out. So every night it gets closed, every day it gets opened back up. So we had a guide who took us to many of the sites of, they call them the troubles that were happening in Belfast there. And the family of the guide is one of the people who are trying to reconcile both sides. It turns out that in Belfast, the vast majority of kids who are Protestant, they still go to Protestant-only schools. And the vast majority of the Catholics still go to Catholic-only schools. So the people don't even know each other. So the guide is part of this organization. That's my brother. That's not the guide. Striving toward a restorative society, trying to introduce people and just get them to know each other so that they're not just in their own little bubbles, but can actually see the other people. They're normal people. They have the same kind of hopes and dreams that their side does. But one thing that the guide said struck me, and that is that much of the resentment can't end until the last generation dies off. And he said that because there are so many people who were personally affected. They had their family members or their kids killed during the bombing. And he said those people will never be able to reconcile. Which is that's so sad. But some things won't happen in this life. And it's actually okay. Some people can't let go of that grudge or that injustice, even if it's a perceived injustice that they they think has been perpetrated on them. But fortunately, God has a plan for them. God's going to take them out of that environment, out of that peer group, because there is something called the second resurrection, right? They're going to die and they're going to be raised up, and they're not going to be in whatever war zone they're in. Because it seems so helpless, right? Ireland seems like it's okay right now, but then you have the Israelis and the Palestinians, and if you just think on human level, what hope is there that any of it is going to be solved permanently, right? But like the guide said, some people will just have to die off. And then the next generation, they don't have the fresh memory of the wars or the atrocities. So that's going to work, right? If God can strike down Paul with a vision and give him blindness for a few days, and that gets Paul's attention, so he starts listening to God and turns around and goes a different way. If he can get that attention, then surely dying is enough to get people's attention. Dying and being resurrected in that second resurrection, surely that's enough to get anybody to listen and wake up and see that it's time to go a different way. So God is the ultimate reconciler. He has that great white throne judgment ready. It's part of his plan. And we're called to a ministry of reconciliation now in this life. But God has a plan of reconciliation that goes way beyond that. And it's so wonderful to be part of God's plan of reconciliation.